We have a fascinating show for you. Breaking news. We live in a very violent society. And so today we are asking the question, why is it that serial killers almost invariably start by torturing animals? You're looking at a serial killer right there. It's a well known fact. The FBI will tell you most serial killers start out by torturing animals. Take Israel Keys. He is believed to have murdered at least 11 and possibly as many as 20 people. He also committed dozens of other crimes, including armed robbery, rape, arson, burglary, and a wide-ranging spree of violence that lasted over a decade. He's committed suicide in 2012, the same year as you see him there being interrogated by authorities. He was 34 years old and he was awaiting trial. But here's the thing, these are some of his tools of torture. He started by torturing animals. What does that tell you about the people who systematically abuse animals? They don't all become serial killers like this monster, but there is something poisonous about them. And then there are those who allow others to torture and kill animals while they look the other way. Where does society draw the line? And by the way, if you have any information on this case, please call the FBI. We're so excited to have Andrew Iden, the co-host of the hot new Deviant podcast. He is here to talk about, well, why do serial killers start by torturing animals? Take it away, Andrew. Why do you think they do?
Hey, Jane, thanks for having me. Honestly, I think obviously it's a wrinkle in the psychology, right? I think that some of the research that I've read has talked about how a lot of this is rooted in rejection, and as adolescents, people like Israel Keys, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, they were dealing with the rejection in some way, and at some point, that rejection, they have to deal with that. And a lot of times, some of the research that I was reading has kind of explained that rejection then manifests itself in going after something weaker than they are. And obviously that is, from all of our perspectives, that's animals. And so that graduates, obviously, for some people, that graduates, that abuse, that torture, that graduates to humans. And that's where, you find people like Israel Keys and Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer who, extrapolate out that behavior on their fellow on people.
Absolutely. You raise a very excellent point. It's when they feel powerful over helpless beings. And what could be more helpless than an innocent animal? Now, one of the reasons we're covering this case, not only that I'm good friends with somebody I used to work with, Clark Goldband. He used to work at Nancy Grace on HLN. I used to work not only for Nancy Grace, but have the show leading into Nancy Grace's show on HLN. So we go way back. And when I heard that Clark was starting a new podcast, which I found out about on LinkedIn, I said, well, he reached out to me. He said, you want to cover this? I said, I only really cover stories that involve animals, animal welfare, animal rights, the climate, and human health. And he said, well, we could talk about serial killers because invariably, virtually all serial killers started out by torturing animals. So here we are talking about that. It's a very good question. Now, what I want to do is first play a soundbite of this sicko himself talking. And what struck me as I listened to this is how matter of fact his voice is when he's talking about not only torturing animals, but how his friends were shocked. And he found that very amusing. So let's listen to this guy. And I watched must be an hour of interrogation when he was under arrest, being interrogated, awaiting trial. And his voice is very like another day at the office. There is no drama, no nothing. He could be talking about, a filing system that he has to develop or some accounting work he has to do. There's no evidence that we're talking about human beings who have lost their lives. And he was equally just cold, sang-froid about torturing animals. So let's listen to that.
Then I looked over at everybody else, and the kid who was about my age was with me. He was throwing up, like he was like really, I don't know, traumatized, I guess you would say. And he told his dad about it, and then of course his dad talked to my parents about it, and that was pretty much the last time anybody went in the woods with me. I learned my lesson. I've known since I was 14 that there were things that that I thought were normal and that were okay that nobody else seems to think are normal and okay.
So he's talking about torturing a cat, Andrew.
Yeah, well, it's important to note kind of the context around that is that in these interviews, Israel Keys talks a lot about his upbringing. And so what he was talking about there was he was telling the story of one of the first times he tortured the family cat. And what's telling about that is that, you know, we chose not to in the podcast. We chose to avoid talking and giving some of the graphic detail that he went into because it's horrific. But why it's poignant is what it does is it really outlines for us the moment that this guy realized that he was different from everybody else. And the moment that he realized, oh, what I'm doing is not normal. This is something that other people find completely deplorable. And so it was really a flashpoint for him as an adolescent of, you know, this is a completely different thing that other people are not used to.
Yes. And also, what I noticed is a complete lack of empathy. I mean, he is literally laughing about the fact that a kid who was his friend or neighbor or cohort in some way is literally throwing up in disgust and horror about what he's telling, and he's laughing.
Yeah.
And so there's a complete lack of empathy, trying to find the commonalities of why serial killers begin by torturing animals, and what is it about them that makes them different, if they are indeed different, because we'll get to that in a second.
Right. And you know, you mentioned that it's the lack of empathy, right? I mean, and this is also common in pretty much any story you're dealing with a murderer of some kind. You know, obviously there's the passion crimes, but like when you're talking about someone who is a sociopath, right? And they are lacking empathy, that is to a T and to, you know, without question, the hallmark here of Israel Keys, of the Ted Bundys, of the John Wayne Gacy's, Jeffrey Dahmers of the world, right? There's a complete lack of empathy. And because of that wiring, it changes their entire dynamic moving forward. And so that's what's been interesting in the show is that, you know, in our first run of episodes, we're diving into the Keys story specifically. And it's, you know, all throughout his interrogation tapes that he sits down and talks to investigators, there's a ton of laughter. There's a ton of detachment from the gravity of what he did. There's a ton of complete disregard for, you know, human feelings, relationships, etc. And it's really a fascinating thing to listen to.
It really is, and it's terrifying. We want to play basically the FBI. I'm curious if they have determined exactly how many people this Israel Keys actually killed. We know it's definitely 3. They believe it's 11 for sure, but it could be as many as 20. So let's just play that FBI announcement, and then we'll talk about that on the other side.
The FBI releases interviews and a timeline of events of confessed serial killer Israel Keys in hopes of identifying his homicide victims. I'm Molly Halpern of the Bureau, and this is Wanted by the FBI. Investigators say Israel Keys, who took his own life in jail, committed 11 homicides across the country between 2001 and 2012. Case agent Jolene Godin says investigators have identified 3 victims.
It's really important to us to be able to bring type of closure to family members that are still wondering what happened to their loved ones.
Keys also admitted to to multiple kidnappings, bank robberies, home invasions, and arsons. He told investigators he buried caches of money, tools, and weapons across the country to help him commit his crimes.
Our primary concern is identifying additional homicide victims, but we're certainly also interested in identifying other crimes that he committed because it will help us put him in a particular place in the country.
He's told FBI agents he related the most with convicted serial killer Ted Bundy.
He didn't really have remorse, he didn't have empathy.
Visit FBI.gov for details of Keyes' travels and interviews. Report tips to 1-800-CALL-FBI.
So from your study of this, when did he graduate, if we can say that, from torturing animals, the family cat, etc., to torturing, stalking, and killing humans?
Well, it's a little difficult to pin down, but there's a belief that perhaps one of the first murders he ever committed was in 2001. The first one we know about is 2009, which was a woman by the name of Deborah Feldman, and he never confessed. And it's important to delineate all of this because he never confessed to the murder of Deborah Feldman. What he did was he gave investigators just enough information to lead them to believe he had committed a crime in a certain geographic area in New York. And what they found on his computer was they found her name and him searching for her name. So they aligned that with his travels, and they realized he was in the area where she went missing at the time. And so they have now attributed that murder to him. He never confessed to that murder. However, he did confess, and that was in 2009. In 2011, he killed Bill and Lorraine Currier in Essex, Vermont. That's 2 murders he confessed to. And then in 2012, the murder and kidnapping that led to his arrest of Samantha Koenig in Anchorage, Alaska. So essentially, the FBI has 4 murders they are kind of putting on his docket. And the reason they've got that number of 11 is because, as you know, but some of your audience may not, before his suicide in 2012, investigators found in his jail cell, they found a sketch. And that sketch was a drawing of 11 skulls. And those skulls were sketched in his own blood. And so investigators believe this was sort of a final manifesto, as it were, of this is the full picture of my life of homicide and murder. So if you take the 11 and you take the 4 away that he has essentially confessed to or been is responsible for, that means there are now 7 that the FBI feel like he has been that he has committed at some point. And trying to piece together what those 7 are is obviously the story and the mystery that we're all trying to figure out now.
Well, it's fascinating in a bad way. Let's hear a friend describe how he perceived of this serial killer.
We were sitting around at a potluck, probably, I don't know, maybe 6 or 8 of us. And we were talking about different things that we were doing for fun, and kind of it would ping pong back and forth. And it came around to Israel, and Israel started telling this story about what he did for fun. And he said, "Yeah, you know what I do for fun? I play with cats." And the rest of us were like, "Well, that's kind of odd." And I guess maybe it showed on our faces. And he said, "Cats have a tremendous ability to absorb pain." And so then in excruciating detail, he started to explain. I remember sitting kind of glancing out of the corner of my eye to everybody else to kind of, take the temperature. Does everybody else think this is as weird as I do? And everybody else was kind of just stunned. And I think I said something like, "Man, that's weird. That's just weird. That's not okay." And he kind of chuckled it off, and he said, "Yeah, well, it's not for everybody."
So there we have sadism as well, which he's laughing and enjoying the suffering of the animals he has tortured.
Right.
So, we're coming up with some commonalities here. We're coming up with lack of empathy, feeling rejected. And as we know, most people who commit any crime feel somehow entitled, somehow they're the victims and they're entitled to do this. And then you have sort of the sadistic aspect where they enjoy the suffering of others. So I want to switch gears to an even more controversial topic.
Okay.
And that is, well, what about society's torture of animals? Animals are being tortured by the billions on a daily basis, but it's institutionalized. It's not something that is happening by a single person who happens to be a serial killer. It's funny because Bill Maher addressed this recently. Let's listen to what he had to say, the famous comedian, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
New rule, listen to PETA. According to polls, a majority of people now agree with what PETA's been saying since 1980. Experiments on animals are not only cruel, they don't work. 95% of new medications that work when tested on animals fail in humans. 95%. A drug tested on a mouse has about as much chance of making it to the market as Joe Exotic has of seeing his mullet come back in fashion. Taxpayers have spent billions funding junk science, like cutting open cats' skulls and deafening them, or tearing baby monkeys from their mothers and tormenting them with loud noises and rubber snakes, all the while admitting that their work isn't applicable to humans. These are the sort of things that if a child did them, you'd know they were going to grow up to be a serial killer.
There he goes. He said it himself. It's being done institutionally. But if the same act of torture were done by an individual, we would call them a budding serial killer.
Right. No, you're right. And statistics that I've looked at basically kind of outline some of that stuff, which is, animal abusers, according to the Department of Justice, say that, they are 5 times more likely to commit violent crimes against people. So it is a telltale sign. It doesn't mean that every single person who abuses animals is going to be a serial killer. Obviously, that's not what we're saying. But what it does do is it seems to increase the likelihood and make you, think twice about the seriousness of that for kids, honestly, when they're young.
Well, yes. And I guess my question is, who bears responsibility for society's acceptance of institutionalized animal torture?
Yeah.
So if we're saying, well, it's the government, we are forced to pay our tax dollars toward that torture, but we don't really have a say over it. But most people just accept it as the way it is. Do they bear moral responsibility if they're not standing up and saying, hey, that's wrong, and protesting it?
Right. Well, I don't know if I would necessarily say that to not protest, it means they bear responsibility. But I do think that you make a valid point, which is that, institutionally, that you could make the argument here that there is a lack of empathy in a lot of places, right? Like, we're talking about criminals who do these horrific things, and there's a lack of empathy. But there is also perfect examples of that, through this institutional abuse that you're talking about, which is like, well, that's a lack of empathy too, to some extent. So, it's just an interesting way to look at it.
Yes. And if we look at our society's behavior toward literally billions of animals, let's take a look at just one thing, one example of what society does to animals that is increasingly controversial. California passed a proposition called Proposition 12 to outlaw what is called pig gestation crates, but nevertheless, it's being fought. It's fought all the way up to the Supreme Court. And then despite that, there's still an effort to try to make it okay in the Farm Bill. Now, these are pig gestation crates. Crates where pigs are kept in crates the size of their bodies, unable to ever turn around to even scratch themselves. Now, as far as I'm concerned, this is institutionalized torture. These animals go mad. They break their teeth on the bars. And California has said with Proposition 12, we will not allow any sale of any product that involves pig gestation crates. The industry fought it all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court actually sided with the people of California who overwhelmingly passed this and said Prop 12 stands. And now, as the Farm Bill is debated and they decide what the policies toward agriculture will be for the next 5 years, there are legislators that are trying to, again, invalidate Proposition 12 and say, this is okay. When, in my opinion, this is clearly a torture device. So again, it's great to point our fingers at individual serial killers, but when something like that is happening on a societal basis to many millions of animals, how do we come to terms with that while at the same time condemning serial killers as monsters and, in a sense, almost subhuman? Are they really that different from society at large?
No, I mean, it's a good question and one worth asking. I think one of the and honestly, one of the things that makes, because you ask about are they that much different than us? And I would say on one level, yes, they are. Obviously, they're very different. They're doing horrific things. But the other thing that I think, and one of the reasons why I think people are so fascinated with this kind of thing, is because they are just like us. We see ourselves. They go to work every day. They have families. They have friends, and like we can relate to certain elements of that, and that's why we all look and watch, is because it's like, wait a second, they're very different from us. But as far as the responsibility is concerned, and like who's bearing that, I don't know the answer to that. But I would ask you, what do you think? What is the answer to that?
Well, personally, I think it's sociopathic behavior on a large scale. The only thing that is required for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. I didn't say that. That's a very famous saying.
Right.
And that is why, for example, the SAVE movement, which is based on the philosophy of Leo Tolstoy, who said famously, when you see suffering, you have a moral obligation not to turn away and pretend it's not happening and ignore it, but get as close as you can, see if you can help, try to help any way you can, and even if you can't help, to bear witness.
Right.
And that is the basis of a SAVE movement, where all around the world now people are bearing witness at slaughterhouses and holding candles, giving water, and a loving touch to animals who are going into slaughter.
Yeah.
So, these are important issues to look at, but they're outside of the box of crime.
Right.
When I had a crime show, it was almost guaranteed that one of our panelists would describe the bad guy, the guy who's done the killing and who's been arrested, or either convicted or on trial, as an animal. He's an animal. And I would always say, why are you calling him an animal? Animals are not torturing. They don't get pleasure out of torturing other beings. That's the demonization of animals. So one of the other reasons that I think that people accept the institutionalized torture of animals is that we have denigrated animals so much in our society that they don't count, that they're considered mere objects. So what's happening to these animals behind closed doors, and I'll just give you a headline: you're more likely to go to prison for exposing animal cruelty than for committing it. So California could send a man to prison for 3.5 years for rescuing factory farmed animals. So our society not only looks the other way when it comes to the suffering of all these animals, while simultaneously saying we're animal lovers because we have dogs and cats, but additionally punishes people quite severely who speak out and say, hey, look what's happening. Look what's happening in the laboratories. Look what's happening in the factory farms, where billions of animals,
Right.
more than 80 billion animals every year, are raised in what I certainly consider, and many other people consider, industrialized torture, and killed. And yet nobody acknowledges that as the violence and the torture that it seems obvious it is. This is what you're looking at here are pig gestation crates in a factory farm, and they go on for the hundreds. And as you can see, these animals can't turn around. I mean, look, who invented this? This is when the first time I saw this, which was probably about 20 years ago, I said, no, it can't be. They can't do this. Nobody would invent this torture device, only to find out it's being used all over the world. And California is the first one now to step up and say, Absolutely not. And, California is the fifth largest economy in the world, very possibly about to become the fourth largest economy in the world. So it's a huge, huge step forward
Yeah.
that it's even being discussed, Andrew.
Sure. Let me ask you this, because I mean, you're the person to ask this. I mean, this is a huge uphill climb that you're talking about, which and you know, props to you and your audience for being willing to fight against that and go up against that. But these are huge companies with billion-dollar revenues. My question to you is, and I don't even know if victory is the right word, but what is the resolution and the answer to what you're proposing and what you're saying? And like, how do we, you showed those gestation crates, like, how do we get those crates to open, and how do we get to a point where now we have a solution here, and this has resolved itself? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, ultimately, it's a consumer issue.
Right.
If people didn't buy the bacon and the hot dogs and the pork chops, they wouldn't do it.
Right.
A. B. It's a government issue because the government subsidizes those industries. They give very little money to like fruits, vegetables, nuts, grains, and legumes that are consumed by people.
Right.
They subsidize to the tune of many billions commodity crops that make meat cheap, like corn and soy. And the people don't even realize that the overwhelming majority of soy that's produced goes to farmed animals. People go, oh, you're eating soy. Well, you know what? When you eat a steak, you're eating compressed soy, because literally more than 80% of all soy produced goes directly into farmed animals. So it's legislative change and it's consumer change. It's cultural change. But what first has to happen is conversations like this. I mean, in mainstream media, I could never have a conversation like this.
Right.
I would be shut down so fast, I'd be kicked out the door. And I have been kicked out that door. But I will say, I'll give HLN some credit. For 6 years, I had my own show on CNN Headline News, HLN. And when I first got hired, I said, would you mind if I did an animal segment once a week? And they thought about it and they said, no, we think that's okay. Maybe they thought I was going to do pet adoptions. I did hardcore. I showed pig gestation crates right off the bat. And I actually had producers come to me and say, can you just not assign me those stories? They're too disturbing. I actually am having trouble sleeping. That somebody said to me. That's how bad it is when you look at the raw tape.
Yeah.
But I will give HLN credit. For 6 years, they didn't stop me. Every Friday, I did a 4-minute segment covering one of these aspects.
Yeah.
But that is an exception to the rule.
Yeah.
So I think what's most important is getting it out into the ether. That's why I thought I'd love to talk to the host of these shows, Deviant. A, because I love Clark. He's a great guy. I wish him the very best with his show. And before you go, I only have 2 minutes. I want you to tell me how everybody can watch. But the second reason is that this is a really important issue to get out there.
Yeah.
This is the torture that dare not speak its name.
Sure.
So tell me a little bit about your show before you go.
Yeah. So Deviant is available now wherever you get your podcasts. Apple, Spotify, iHeart, Odyssey, all those things. And it's essentially a story a show that will delve into kind of the dark corners of what people are capable of. The tagline we like to say is that it's good stories about bad people who do very bad things. And the kind of the idea of the show is that we will tell a story for as long as it needs to be told and as long as it is good. So the first 7 episodes, the first kind of mini series, is about Israel Keys, who we were talking about at the top of your show. After that 7-episode run, we will come back the very next week and we're going to have a new story that will run for, a open-ended amount of time. And the goal of this show is not necessarily just to kind of turn on the microphones and talk about crime, but we're doing this with a journalistic bent, right? Like Clark and I and Dan, the three of us spent years at CNN and are using our journalistic chops and our journalistic sensibilities to tell these stories in a very, in kind of a long form, articulate, documentary style way. We're going to talk to the police. We're going to talk to the people that are involved in the story instead of just kind of sitting, outside the thing and looking inside the fishbowl. We're going to go in and we're going to talk to people. So the show is called Deviant and it's available wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, I want to thank you for being very brave to come on this show. because most people would say, "Oh no, she's an animal rights activist.
Oh,
I'm
no, no,
not
no, no,
going to
no
go on
problem.
that show."
No, bless you, Jane, for all you do. The animals need voices, and I'm glad that you're one of them. So it's an honor to be here.
I want to thank you so much, Andrew, and come back with the next serial killer, and
I
we'll
will.
continue this
I
conversation.
will. I will. Thank you so much.
All right, have a good one. Thank you
All right,
so
bye-bye.
much. Bye. So, while he leaves, I want to continue this conversation because I think it's really important. And essentially, I'm talking to myself right now, but it was really interesting to get a blast from the past because I spent 38 years actually in mainstream media and, in local news and syndicated and national news, most recently at CNN Headline News, where I had my own show for 6 years. Primarily, we talked about crime because if you want to talk about the news of the day, sadly, the news of the day is about violence. And we decry violence and we beat our chests, but then we ignore the very violence that we are committing. So, hey, guest, if you go vegan, I will listen to your podcast. Thank you, Vegan Rebel. I wish he had seen that. But we need to have those conversations. Like, even if that is just barely touching the surface, because he asked a very good question. Well, you've pointed out these torturous, industrialized methods. What's going to change it? What's going to change it is people standing up and saying, no, I will not purchase this. I will not participate in this. And a lot of people say, I passed a building this morning, walking my dogs, and they had very elegant building written love, 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 love all over the building, the side of the building in a very kind of artsy way. And the first thing I thought about is, are they eating animal carcasses inside that building? I passed a bumper sticker recently where somebody said, have a blessed day, and I happened to be pulling up next to them and our windows were down. I said, does that apply to the animals too? Do everything with love. There was somebody else who had a big sign that said, do everything with love. And I actually didn't ask her, but I wanted to, because she had a big sign on the side of her house. I wanted to ask her, does that include how we treat animals? I just got a text from a good friend of mine who I've known for years and who's a wonderful person. And she said, look, she just sent this to me out of the blue. May you be at peace. May your heart remain open. May you awaken to the light of your own true nature. May you be healed. May you be a source of healing for all beings. This is Tibetan Buddhist prayer. May you be a source of healing for all beings. And I texted back, I like the all beings part. Now, my dear friend, and I love her. She's an old friend, a good friend. She's been there for me many times. She's an attorney and will step up to the plate when I need help. She did that recently, pro bono. But she's not a vegan. How do we help people who are otherwise compassionate, otherwise kind, otherwise evolved, realize that this is a big gaping hole in their value system? This is the challenge for everyone who has woken up and who has discarded animal products. And one of the things that I think is most important is that we realize that it's extremely important to be vegan, but it's not enough. Wayne Shung, the co-founder of Direct Action Everywhere, who heads the Simple Heart Initiative, recently said, if everybody who is vegan became an activist, we could achieve animal liberation almost immediately. Because there's that old calculation. I don't know if it's Malcolm Gladwell particularly. He wrote a great book called The Tipping Point. But there is a calculation, some say, when you hit 3.5% of the population, it flips. And what is the outlier becomes normal. We're talking about normalizing compassion to animals through diet and lifestyle, clothing, etc. So, how do we normalize that compassion? If we look back in history, there are plenty of things that we look at and go, oh my God. I mean, I could think of a dozen off the top of my head. How is it that human beings allowed that to happen? How didn't we stand up? Why didn't they stand up and say something? Well, are you standing up and saying something now about the systematized torture of billions of animals? And I've got Unchained TV back there. It keeps going to screensaver, but that's our streaming network, Unchained TV. That's why I started it. I was in mainstream media for 38 years. I can tell you my entire career in 30 seconds. I went to NYU, got a BA in broadcast journalism. My first job was in Fort Myers, Florida as a reporter and anchor. My second job was in Minneapolis as a reporter. My third job was in Philadelphia as a reporter and anchor. My fourth job was at WCBS TV in New York as a reporter and anchor, where I worked for 8 years. Then I moved to LA, where I was a weekday anchor working out of Paramount Studios for a Disney-owned station for 12 years, anchoring next to one of the most famous local news anchors ever, Jerry Dunphy. And then I jumped to syndication, Celebrity Justice. By that time, I had gone vegan. And while I was at Celebrity Justice, I started doing animal rights stories because the theme of Celebrity Justice was, where's the justice, where's the celebrity? So I worked with PETA to get big celebrities who wouldn't talk to a tabloid under any circumstances, but they made an exception because they cared so much about that one animal issue. One of my greatest achievements was I got a one-on-one interview with Robert Redford, of all people, who's a lovely man, who was very concerned about the military sonar impact on whales. And he actually literally almost pushed his publicist out of the way. They didn't want him to talk to a tabloid show called Celebrity Justice, but he was so concerned about the whales that he spoke to me. After working on that show, I then got ultimately a show on CNN Headline News, my own show, Issues with Jane Velez-Mitchell, where I, as I mentioned earlier, reported on animal issues once a week on Fridays for 4 minutes for 6 years. And that was seen in 39 countries by millions and millions of people. When that wrapped up, after a nice run, 6 years, these shows generally don't last forever. Not everybody is Barbara Walters. May she rest in peace. But after that, what I did was I said, wow, well, I've already been in this business 38 years. Time to do something different. I want to follow my passion. I started going out with a GoPro camera, covering stories, animal rights stories. Because when you are a news host, okay, you can't just go to protests and start marching around. You have to remain objective, and you can't participate in protests. And they weren't going to allow me to cover protests like live. So it was exciting for me to go out for the first time in my life after a long career and start videotaping with a GoPro camera. This is way before Facebook Live in literally 2015. One of the first protests I covered was outside the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, New York. My hands were shaking. It was 9 degrees. I had this little GoPro camera and I said, is this worth it? And then I looked around, 200 people, including children, all lined up protesting animals being used in the circus. And I said, if they can do it in the cold here, I certainly can record it. I started doing these stories. Then ultimately I created a nonprofit, which is the Jane Unchained News Network. And now we're Unchained TV, which is a global streaming television network, which you can see behind me. And we have approximately 2,000 videos, and this is going to be one of them, talking about animal rights, animals, and how our abuse of animals through food primarily, but also in other ways, is destroying the environment. It's causing the Amazon to be deforested. It's causing wildlife extinction, habitat destruction, ocean dead zones. And we talk about incredible organizations like Animal Rising out of England, Plant-Based Treaty, the Rowdy Girl Sanctuary. We have many different organizations that we profile. We talk about wildlife. It takes a lot to collect all of these videos. Working around the clock. I do not take a salary, by the way. I donate to my own nonprofit. But we need the general public, and particularly vegans, to embrace this and be spokespeople for this. We don't have multi-million-dollar budgets to tell people, hey, you got to watch this. You you drive down Sunset Boulevard, you see these giant electronic screens for the other networks like Netflix. We don't have that budget. We need you, vegans and vegan activists, to spread the word. And the first thing you can do is download Unchained TV, which you can download for everything is free. We do not charge a penny for any video. You can download Unchained TV right on your phone. You just go to your app store, you put in Unchained TV, whether you have an Apple TV device or whether you have an Android device. Literally, you go to your app store or Google Play, put in the word Unchained TV, one word, and up it pops. You can also put it on your TV here. This is a Roku device. If you have a Roku device, you just put in Unchained TV and boom, it comes up. If you have an Amazon Fire Stick, it comes up. If you have an Apple TV device, and if you have a Samsung TV like I have at home, oh dear, that's one of our shows. You touch it and it starts playing. Another good thing is you can text any video to somebody. So if somebody says, I could never give up cheese, boom, you just find a vegan cheese recipe, hit it. If somebody says, oh, it's not so bad, these animals have it okay, or as somebody said to me once, I'm very careful about the meat I eat. I eat sustainably raised, compassionately slaughtered meat. Well, I just texted her Dominion. There is no way to kill an animal who does not want to die. There is no, in fact, I just talked yesterday to an organization that's going to tell me about an expose of a backyard butcher, locally grown, locally slaughtered. That's another myth. But we've put this together, but we need everybody to go out and spread the word about this. And thank you, Paige. Yes, it is powerful content. And Paige is one of our key supporters, and we're primarily volunteer run, and Paige is one of the leaders in that, always letting us know about the very latest thing. Ellen Dent as well with the plant-based treaty helping us. So when I got the chance to go back to my crime days, when they contacted me and they said, we've just started this podcast and we want you to talk about we want you to interview us. I said, okay. I said, but I only talk about animal rights and veganism and climate change and human health. I said, where's the connection? And they said, well, virtually all serial killers start by torturing animals. I said, well, yes, I'm aware of that. So let's talk about that. So we just did an interview with a mainstream podcast that focuses on crime. And I love them and I wish them the very best. But I can tell you, having been in the crime genre for many years, and it's not something I am particularly interested in. I'm interested in avoiding becoming a victim of crime, but I'm not a crime buff. I've never been. I don't care. I'm an environmentalist and an animal rights activist. But I will say that the opportunity to go back to that old genre that I used to have to immerse myself in, but put a new spin on it, right? What are we doing? And that's why I asked, okay, yes. Our first question was, why do serial killers start by torturing animals? But my next question was, who bears responsibility for society's acceptance of institutionalized animal torture, which is happening today on a scale never before seen in human history or animal history? Now, we already showed you the pig gestation crates, but I got to show you this horror. This was obtained by a Freedom of Information Act request. This is ventilation shutdown, and this poor chicken is being baked alive at a laboratory where they're testing a new way of killing animals in mass. And they're killing them by the many millions. And what they're doing is, it's basically about bird flu. This time, a cruel way to control bird flu, poultry giants cull and cash in. This is the New York Times. Big poultry farms have received millions of dollars for their losses. Animal welfare groups contend that aid reinforces inhumane culling of birds exposed to the virus. So now I can tell you what they're doing with our tax dollars, which really enrages me, is due to overcrowded conditions in factory farms, which is how 99.9% of all animals that are consumed for food are raised. There's outbreaks of things like bird flu, and now they're in a preventative way. If they find one or a couple of animals with bird flu, they kill hundreds of thousands of them. And guess who's paying for that? Taxpayers. Now, Our Honor, which is an incredible organization, recently talked to us about this, and I want to show you video of a chicken that survived. They don't die instantly. They basically seal off and they pump in heat, and they literally bake these animals to death. It can take hours. One chicken survived, and she sent me a video of the chicken who survived. This is torture. More than 2,000 veterinarians have signed on saying ventilation shutdown is morally repugnant. And, this animal, after being essentially baked alive, is the one animal in this ventilation shutdown procedure who survived. But, if you go back to the whole serial killer mindset, which we documented earlier, as we talked about this one particular serial killer, the commonality is that there is no empathy, there is sadism and enjoyment of the suffering of others, and there is a callousness and even a lightheartedness about the suffering of others. So this serial killer killed himself in 2012 while awaiting trial and joked about how he tortured cats growing up and other animals. And he ended up, these are some of his torture devices that were found, killing at least, for sure, 3, almost certainly 11, but possibly as many as 20 people in a coast-to-coast killing spree, to the point that the FBI is still asking people out there, do you know anything about this? And his hero was Ted Bundy. So we condemn those people correctly as monsters. But what about all the torture that's going on institutionally? What about this chicken that scientists said it was okay to put this particular being in a container, and then you see the wires, turn up the heat, and watch this animal slowly bake to death? That is torture. And then we showed you the result of one animal who survived that. And it's so bad that 2,000 veterinarians have signed a letter organized by Our Honor, veterinarian Dr. Crystal Heath, who started that organization. And she puts it this way: ventilation shutdown is a brutal, painful method of animal depopulation. These mass killings deviate from normal slaughterhouse procedures, which I might say are horrific in themselves, and are now being used in the pork and poultry industries. So where is the condemnation that we issue against serial killers for doing the exact same thing when it's being done systematically to hundreds of thousands, even millions of animals? And our tax dollars are reimbursing those companies. Lindsay Baker says this is terrifying, and it is terrifying. It is absolutely terrifying. And Vegan Rebel says, how sick does one have to be to do that to an innocent being? Our society is sick. And when people stand up against it, they often get arrested and prosecuted. So we have, at Unchained TV, we've covered those prosecutions. For example, Alexandra Paul, and I want to play, she was luckily acquitted, but she was put on trial for rescuing. I'll show you the rescue. They basically, look at this. It's a right to rescue trial. She was acquitted along with her co-defendant, Alicia Santurio. And there they are taking these 2 chickens off of a truck bound for slaughter. And they're saying, hey, it's animal liberation, but authorities said, no, you stole an object and you're going to be prosecuted. And she actually has taken the stand, testifying in her own defense, testifying in defense of other animal activists who've been arrested and charged. This takes tremendous courage. I mean, and by the way, Alexandra Paul is famous from being on Baywatch. She's a famous actress. But here's what she said about why she does things like that.
We also choose these animals because they tell best the story of what's going on behind these closed doors. And we document it and we share it with the world because nobody else is showing people what's going on. The only reason people know what's going on behind these closed doors is because of animal investigators.
And then look at this. Okay, these are some of the open rescues of animals trapped in factory farms in conditions that I certainly believe are horrifically cruel. And what does society do? They send out police in force. And I often say, meanwhile, I'm scared to walk my dogs after 10 o'clock at night. Where are all these law enforcement officers when I need them, when I, law-abiding citizen, tax-paying citizen, just want to safely walk my dogs? But look at that police presence. Because these folks are speaking up for animals that are being systematically tortured in factory farming. It's the way it goes. So, we'll just show you a little footage of what this isn't just an average factory farm. Okay? This is what is going on in these factory farms. And, it's not any one particular factory farm. There's no nice way to raise hundreds of thousands of animals in a shed. And when Wayne Shung was being put on trial, he talked about the fact that it's an upside down world. Let's listen to what he had to say.
Yesterday on the stand, the farmer claims he's a small farmer. He has 200,000 birds in a single building. He claims that the animals are living in a stress-free environment, while also conceding that some of the animals are actually cannibalizing each other. Does that sound stress-free to you? And then the last thing, which I thought was most disturbing, our workers don't wring the animals' necks, they're gassed to death. And we deserve a gold star for this. It felt like some sort of bizarre world where left was right, up was down. It didn't make any sense to me. He can say all these things. He can make it seem like getting gassed to death is like going to Disney World, and we're not allowed to show the footage of what actually happened.
So I want to thank you for joining us today. My message is, please download Unchained TV. We really need everybody's help. We cannot do it alone. We are working around the clock to make this happen and get the word out there, because people can say it's not that bad, but when they actually see it and they download Unchained TV and they actually see what's going on, they can't hide anymore. And then they are more likely to make the change. In fact, somebody told me the other day they were on Unchained TV for 20 minutes and they went vegan. So we need you guys to help us spread the word about all the content that we have. And it's not all depressing. There's a lot of fun stuff because we're a happy, joyous lot. Thank you for that, and become active. The clock is ticking. We need to hit the tipping point. See you next time on Unchained TV.